You mentioned then that
yes,
it helped you having those conversations. Do you think you'd have found that form of therapy almost for yourself, talking to people and opening up, had you not found photography?
No, I'd be dead. There's no question about that in my mind. Yeah, no, I was self-medicating. I was drinking really fucking heavily before I had the camera. In fact, having the camera and getting my old dog as a puppy are the two things that stopped me doing that.
If you lead an interesting life, good pictures will happen.
Oh, nice. You might well be my sexiest sounding guest.
Go somewhere you've never been before and take a camera.
We had this gorgeous Mediterranean light just flowing in.
Which Asda were you in?
Dartford.
Very nice.
The first 10,000 pictures are your worst.
Let's sit down, let's have a cup of tea.
Welcome to the show. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to another episode of the Standout Photography Show with me, Matthew Walker, where as always it is my honour and privilege to sit down with some of the finest working photographers in the world to unpack their systems, workflows, and find out what enables them to perform consistently at the very top of their profession. Before I introduce our wonderful guest today, is there someone that you would like to hear on the Standout Photography Show? If so, let me know on Instagram or Twitter at Matthew D.A. Walker. That is at Matthew D.A. Walker. Many of you have done this already, and as a result, I am delighted to say the lineup for the next few weeks is quite something. So, if you want to find out and stay up to speed with who we have coming up on the show, or indeed let me know what you are enjoying about the Standout Photography Show, do give me a follow on the Twittergrams at Matthew D.A. Walker. In the meantime, please allow me to introduce our guest today, British social documentary photographer and writer Jim Mortram. That is at J.A. Mortram on Twitter, Mortram, M-O-R-T-R-A-M, and www.smalltowninertia.co.uk on the World Wide Webs. Based in Dereham, Norfolk, Jim's ongoing project, Small Town Inertia, records the lives of a number of disadvantaged and marginalised people living near his home in order to tell stories he believes are underreported. Jim began Small Town Inertia in 2006 with the Market Town Stories. Its name is a reference to the market town of Dereham, where he lives, 15 miles west of the city of Norwich in Norfolk. Through photography, Jim's writing and his subject's own words, Small Town Inertia tells stories of isolation, poverty, drug abuse, homelessness, self-harm, mental illness, juvenile crime, and epilepsy. Dave Stelfox of The Guardian wrote that Mortram's rich black and white images possess a timeless quality that invites easy comparison with the classic documentary work of such British photographers as Chris Steele Perkins, Paul Trevor, and Chris Killip. Very high praise indeed, but thoroughly deserved. Throughout our conversation, Jim and I discuss truthful storytelling through photography, honesty and empathy in photography, listening to the people that you photograph, building relationships and creating testimonies to amplify your photography, building trust with the people you photograph, and of course publishing his book, or should I say soon to be books, Small Town Inertia. I use the word people rather than subject because to Jim that's what they are, and this is one of those conversations that makes me so incredibly thankful that I started this podcast. Our conversation transcends far beyond photography, but at its core this conversation is about truth and honesty, and that is exactly what Jim portrays in his work. I'm delighted to welcome Jim to the show, so please switch off from the world. I don't say this lightly. This is a very important podcast, so please enjoy my conversation with none other than Mr. Jim Mortram. Jim Mortram, it's an enormous pleasure to say welcome to the Standout Photography Show. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
The pleasure is, as is always the case, all mine. And it really is this. There's been many wonderful things that have come from starting this podcast. And if there is anybody listening that has the slightest inkling to start a podcast, I cannot recommend it enough. I've been so honoured and humbled to be introduced to such wonderful photographers and such wonderful work. One of them, of course, being you. I'd like to start with a quote, or two, actually. One of which you said, which is, it's almost like a duty, a responsibility to use photography and the testimony I share with it to grab people's attention and say, this is what's happening, try and understand. And then I read something else that one of your subjects said about you, and it's Simon, and he said, Jim is a friend and a photographer. He's made a difference to my life. And I was looking at your work, and it's the most truthful account of photography I think I've ever seen. And I said something to Julia Fullerton-Batten, which I'd heard Tom Hanks say about Steven Spielberg, and he said that the reason Spielberg is so successful is that he has a rare ability to elicit an emotional response from his audience. And that is exactly what happens when you look at your work. And when I first came across what you'd been doing, I watched a video by Neil James and I was mesmerized. I couldn't stop watching it. And I messaged you straight away on Twitter and said, look, please would you consider coming on the show and speaking with me? And I was thrilled you kindly agreed. For anyone listening
Thank you.
No, honestly, it really is a genuine pleasure. For anyone that is unfamiliar with you and your work, how do you personally describe yourself and your work as a photographer?
Well, I'm a human being first. That's the most important thing. The photography came quite late in my life. I was in my 30s. I had no aspirations to look at a camera, touch a camera, make photographs. I didn't know anything about photography, really. Certainly didn't know anything about the history of humanist documentary. Do you know what? It's really funny. I had a conversation a little bit earlier today with one of the people that I photograph really regularly, because I'm keeping in touch with everybody, as many of us are, virtually. You know, I'm having to drop in on Facebook, drop in with emails or text, or pick up the landline even for people that don't have access to any of these digital devices. And it was with Helena. We've got we were going to have a physical exhibition. This is how COVID has kind of changed things around. I felt very concerned that wouldn't it be awful if you had put your heart and soul into making this story, and then somebody got sick actually witnessing it. So what we've done is, rather than having a physical exhibition, we're going to I'm going to put together a little film, and it's going to be a virtual exhibition, put it like that. As far as I know, no one's caught COVID from a computer as yet. Maybe other things, but they certainly haven't caught that. So yeah, and we were talking, and part of I was explaining to her what the film's going to be, and I'll send her a first cut, and we're catching up and chatting. And I was trying to explain like a theory that I'd had about, and the only metaphor I could think of was when you throw a stone into a pool. It's a pretty basic metaphor, but when we throw a stone into a pool and the ripples fly out, and if you imagine that the stone that you throw into the pool is an event within your life or an experience within your life. And everybody has that. Everybody's always having these kind of like small explosions, if you like, of happening, of things that affect them. But the ripples span out through time and space and people, and invariably they touch. And part of what we were talking about is how with everybody that I photograph, and everybody whose story I've tried and still try to amplify, we all have something in common. In Helena's instance, she's a rape survivor, and my mother was raped when she was a child. And we were talking about how these two events Obviously, for Helena, it happened to her personally. For me, it happened indirectly. But I've obviously witnessed how it's followed my mother through her life, and to the point that it affected me in a sense that, I mean, it affected me physically. When I was born nearly 2.5 months premature, because as a result of the physical trauma that my mother had endured when she was a child. So this is a kind of a long-winded answer of, I'm a human being first because I take my real emotions within people's homes, and when we share, I'm not walking in cold. I'm not going in with zero life experience. I'm not going in with empathy that's faked. I'm going in with actual empathy as a human being. This is a fundamental thing for me, has always been that these aren't bogus relationships. They're not fraudulent. They are the real relationships that I have in my life. To be honest, I don't really have any within the physical realm. I have my girlfriend, my dog, and everybody that I photograph. I don't have any other friends. I don't socialize. I don't go out and hang out. And when you talk about it being a duty, I also feel like it's a debt of mine to give as much as that which is given to me. You know, if you go into somebody's home, into their life, into their most, sadly, often their most traumatic events within their life, it can't just be a one-way street. I can't just go in there and say, right, okay, tell me everything, click, click, see ya. I can't do that. The person that I am won't allow me to do that. And I also think it's really bad for stories. Stories can't happen. You know, we live in a time that's so fast. We see things so fast. We make judgment calls on information that's not fact-checked, and we have a reaction and things happen. I like to work long form, which means, well, in my case, it means that I know people forever and I'm always doing it, and we're always doing it together. Because, you know, a book is more than its cover. This is the I suppose the real essence of this. When we talk about duty, I've got a duty to represent and amplify the story, not just the cover note, not just the preface, not just the, you know. So yeah, it's a duty because it's informed by my experience as a carer, and I know how frustrating it is to kind of have no one to talk with, no one to share with, no one to really bond with on a level of, look, this is, I mean, we're really bad at talking in England, I think. We're really bad at, we're good at moaning, but we're not so good at talking, and talking without fear of, you know, judgment or condemnation. There's a certain stigma there, I think. I mean, in all frankness, working on these stories has been as good for me as it has been for all the people that do it, because it really is a collaboration. The amount that I've been given in terms of just the opportunity to listen, and in turn, I give of my story. So, for example, to get it back to the start, when I first spoke with Helena, I don't ask people to, how do I put this? It's not as though I could meet a stranger and know their story, because there's more than one story in everyone's life. We're not defined by one single event. But I got to a point where I was kind of being referenced to other people by other people that I'd photographed, and Helena knew someone else that I'd photographed, and we met. And she asked me, would I work on this story? So the question that I almost always ask when I start working with someone is, well, what do you want to talk about? It's not what I want them to talk about. It's what is it that you feel isn't being acknowledged in the world? It could be their immediate world, you know, that within their family or within their community, or it could be nationally. What's not being represented in the news? What are people not understanding?
I'm just listening in absolute amazement to hear the way you speak. And, you know, it's exactly what I was talking about at the beginning, there is a reason that your photography is so incredibly truthful. And I think just hearing you speak, you're so involved in the work that you do. It's far more than just photography. And I think that's why people can relate to your work so much. I was reading before we started speaking, I was just looking through your website, which is Small Town Inertia. Is it .co.uk or .com?
It is.
.co.uk.
And also, if you go to Mortram.co.uk, you can see the first book on there digitally for nothing. So
right, I'll put these links in the show notes. But I was just reading some of the comments, and these are just ones I picked out randomly. There was far more. One said, "I've been deeply moved by the openness and frankness of David and his mother, Eugene. David has shown us a window into his life, and for that I'm grateful, and your photographs have captured David's lonely and isolated world." Another one, "Absolutely beautiful and so sad. I think your work is so touching, and I feel I know David after reading this." And hearing you speak about why you do it, I think from the outside looking in, there's a truthfulness from you. It's like you said, you generally care about these people, and it shows in your work. You mentioned, let's just journey back, because you mentioned that, well, firstly, that you are a carer to your mother, but we'll come on to that in a second. You mentioned that you didn't find photography in the shape or the relationship you have with it now until your 30s. What did you do prior to your work as a photographer and a carer, I suppose?
Yeah, well, we'll go back. I mean, I went to school much like anyone else. Absolutely hated it. I really wanted to be a painter. My mother was very artistic, and I suppose I've got that from her. And painting was not something that you would talk to with your careers teacher at school. Essentially, I was told you're gonna work in Tesco's or a factory. This was before the factories closed down in town. So yeah, school was really difficult. I moved here when I was 11, which is a really weird time to move to a place. When you're 11, it's strange. So I moved straight into a new school, and I'd come from Somerset. My father had left Norfolk, met my mother in Somerset, and then moved back to Norfolk in 1981, 82, I suppose. Yeah, 82.
Here, for anyone unfamiliar, is Dereham in Norfolk.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, sorry, to Dereham. And, you know, as we were saying before we hit the record button, Norfolk then was still a very isolated place, and still much more rural than it is now. And that was a culture shock for me. So going to school was, you know, there wasn't too many kids that wanted to be painters at my school. And it certainly wasn't an option. It was certainly something that was dissuaded. If you had like an artistic bent, that was almost, well, that was the last year of corporal punishment. So it was almost beaten out of you. You know, it was pretty crazy. But I ended up doing A-levels, going to art school, and I was set on track to be a painter. And it was I suppose that would have been early 90s, very early 90s. And that's when my mother started to get really sick. She'd been sick on and off when I was a child, certainly before I was born, when she was a child. But it got to a point that my dad just wasn't coping at all. So I just made the decision to come home and be a carer. I was flush with the arrogance and the ego of youth, where in my mind, this will be 6 months, I can sort it out. And I've been here ever since doing it. It wasn't something that could be fixed. It was only something that you can alleviate. I think of it as I've been to university, or I've been to 2 different schools of teaching. One was when I was studying fine art painting. And then I've done maybe a 20-odd year degree in empathy, because as a carer, you learn quickly that it's not about what you think you can do, or what you want to do, or what you want to say. It's about shut up, listen, and do what the other person wants. And these were things that when I was like 24, I didn't really understand. You're kind of still full of yourself. Or I was, I was going to be a painter. I had a great social life. I had a lot going on. And I came back here and all of a sudden I had no friends. I didn't have a social life at all. And I didn't really understand how bad it was until I got here. One component of my mother's illness is she has seizures, epileptic seizures, but she has a lot of them and the most extreme form. And through that, she has absences and a lot of other physical and mental issues. And it was like, I can only think of an analogy, like it was like being a farm boy in America and you get on a plane and all of a sudden you're in a foxhole in Vietnam. The culture shock was intense for me. And it's this, any carer will tell you this, it's the sustained pressure over time. If you're lucky if you're not a carer in your everyday life, you might go years without seeing somebody in pain or terror or being ill. But if you're a carer, it's an everyday, almost all day, all night occurrence. So it was really a trial by fire for me. Affected me greatly in ways that I never would have perceived. I became completely isolated. I self-medicated. I lost my dream. My dream. The thing is, you feel selfish. I felt selfish that I would sometimes think, well, what the fuck happened to my life? And in those moments, I'd really beat myself up because I felt so selfish about, thinking about myself. This isn't in any way to, how do I say? That's just the fact. That's just the fact of it. You do after like the first 10 years say, oh Christ, I'm 34. I was going to be a painter. This is what's happening. And I hit a really point that was a couple of years. I mean, I spent 1 year, I didn't speak. There was no opportunity to really. My dad was going through a really hard time as well. I can do all my duties. Sometimes it's very difficult to communicate anyway with my mother. Yeah, so to get it back to the photography, at some point, an old mate came round. He had a camera with him and said, look, I can see you're in a bad way. I'll just leave this with you. Just get the fuck out and walk around the village or something. Do something. And that was my introduction to photography. And I did not know at that point that anything else would happen. But it's one of those doorways or junctions in life that change your life completely. I mean, I can tell you that story if you want. I normally tell that story in every interview, so it's up to you. If you've not heard it, I'll give it to you. But feel free to jump in.
I've not heard it, but I was actually going to say, okay. Do you remember what my instinct was to ask, what did you photograph? Do you remember on that first trip where you went out?
The first week I photographed everything that was at my disposal. What I would tend to do is I would go for really long walks in the dead of night, which is a really bad idea in Norfolk because you already feel like you're the last person alive on the planet. But if you do it at like 3 o'clock in the morning in the countryside, wow, it's intense. Yeah, so I started walking around with the camera. It had been left on manual, and I was photographing. This is literally within the first 7 to 14 days. It was trees, sunsets, sheep, bored, really bored. But what happened, when we opened, I started talking about this thing about where you throw a pebble in and the ripples come out. One of the ripples that was coming my way was by an elderly neighbor called WH. I'd see him on these late night walks, early morning walks they are really, and he'd always be awake as well. This was at the point where I wasn't really verbalizing, I wasn't talking, and I'd see him and I'd put my hand up, he'd put his hand up to me, and we kind of built a relationship like this, just seeing each other. He'd put his hand up, he was in his 80s, I'd put my hand up, and he was always in his front porch. He was completely surrounded with detritus, just newspapers, bags, everything. cocooned in there. There's this, I always remember there was the glow of his TV in his face. I find myself walking past his house in the daytime. This would have been about two weeks after I'd first had the camera in my hands. And he just beckons to me to come to him. Okay, so it's literally, the house is still there. There's new people living in there, but it's two doors down. So I did, and I sat down at his feet. I didn't need to say anything because he started talking and talking and talking and talking. And to cut a very long story short, he was really isolated as well. He'd basically moved into his front porch because he was too sad to be in the rest of his house after his wife had died, and his wife had died 20 years before. So essentially he'd kind of lived in this front porch on his own for all of this time. And I can remember vividly having the camera, and I kind of like held it up like this, up to my eye, and like smiled, and he said, "Yeah, that's fine." And I just sat there cross-legged at his feet, and he just poured out a monologue to rival my monologues on your wonderful podcast. He was telling me about the village in the 1920s. He taught me how to waltz. So he was a great socialist. He talked about this. He told me why he had two white sticks in the court. He'd stuck two white sticks in each court fender of his car because he had no peripheral vision. So he thought, well, if I do that, at least I can see that, and I know I won't hit the curb or a person. He was just great. He was wonderful. So I make all these pictures. Don't know what I'm doing, but I'm figuring it out. I had a little introduction to photography in my late teens because my dad would shoot local bands. So it was like a little hobby for him. Really good as well.
And presumably you're shooting on film at this point as well?
No, this was digital. This
was
a very early digital camera. Which was a godsend for me because I could see what was happening. You know, I think if it had been a film camera, nothing would have happened because, for one, I certainly couldn't have afforded to have had the film processed. And I wouldn't have been able to teach myself as quickly. We're still, we're talking, I think I still had a dial-up modem. So yeah, I had some access to the internet, but it wasn't brilliant. But I did have this camera, and I was very quickly able to work out, well, this is overexposed, this is underexposed. Within the first couple of days. It's pretty intuitive, I think, a camera. There's just a couple of buttons and a couple of dials. I didn't go into the menu, and I still don't. I never do. Everything's turned off. But I made these pictures. I looked at them. I remember going into town, and I got some prints made. And I took them to him, and his reaction was spellbinding. He absolutely loved them. He took them to the local pub before that had closed down. He took it to the post office, which is in the village, before that closed down. They kind of like stuck them on the walls, and it gave him a real. He mattered, and he liked the pictures, which was great. And I liked that he liked the pictures. So this went on for a month, maybe two, maybe a little bit longer. Then I find out that he's got cancer, and we have one last visit together. Not that I knew it at the time, because he was going to go into hospital to have an operation. But he caught an infection and he passed away. And I'd lost like the first friend I'd had in years. But what he did in leaving gave me a blueprint of what I would invariably do for the rest of my life. It's the most incredible moment of clarity. My initial reaction when I found out he'd passed away was I was devastated. I cried for the first time in years. It was all these repressed emotions. You have to bottle stuff. That was my way of coping. I didn't really have a choice. What do you do if you're in a situation where you live with a father that's had 3 nervous breakdowns, as I think any man would if he'd seen what his wife has had to go through. I couldn't really talk to him. I couldn't really talk to my mother, so I had no one to talk to. I didn't have anyone that I could offload stress. There was no bleed valve at all, so it was all building up. He passed away. I was devastated, but then I started thinking about it. I was looking at the pictures. I'd begun sharing a few to Flickr in its infancy. I was getting feedback there. And what I was doing was I was remembering things he'd told me and kind of like adding those in with the pictures. Testimony, I guess. At this stage, I don't know anything about photography. I don't know anything about the tradition of long-form photography. I just knew that I felt that it would be really lovely to pay testimony to my friend, you know, that I'd lost. I was having to deal with mortality, which is something that I've always been scared of. I'm certainly scared of it as a carer, because every day I'm faced with a situation where today could be the day that my mum dies. And it's terrifying. But I had this overwhelming feeling that, well, he'll live on in these pictures. WH, he's gone, but he's here. And I realized that I was almost certainly the last person to have a proper conversation with him. You know, not what do you want with your tea? How do you want your intravenous drip put in? I'd talk, you know, I would speak with him. He got me talking. That's the main thing. I'd talk to him about him. I wasn't really big on talking about myself then. I'm still not really. There's definitely a deconstruction of ego when you're forced to live in isolation and you're in a caring position, because there's not really the opportunity for yourself to really, how do you say? You know, in this situation, the person that you're caring about is the important person. I suppose it's a bit like how a parent feels about their kid. You know, you shield your kids from shit you might be going through. You don't lay it all onto your kids. And in a kind of a weird mirroring of that, that's what I was doing with my parents. I wasn't going to tell them, I feel terrible doing this. You know, they felt guilty enough with me being back caring, let alone with me saying this is fucking me up, which it was. So I had these photographs and I had all of these stories in my head, and I'd never seen any long form work. I just independently had the idea that, oh, okay, I'll do this. Now there's another thread to this narrative. This part of the story is the first year of a new Tory government. It's the first year of Tory austerity, and by complete coincidence, the same time I was loaned this camera, BBC4 had a season on photography, and so I find this tool that suddenly gives me this. I've said it before in interviews that it was like I was rebooted. I went back online and I kind of went straight back to my 20-year-old self, and I was very passionate about painting. I found myself again. This camera, this experience I had with WH, it kind of woke me from a slumber in a really powerful way. So I went from kind of being a stone to a sponge. You know, I was very, not to quote Monty from Withnail, not that stone and sponge, but from being very hard and very having to be very hard and suppressing myself to being very hungry for knowledge. On this BBC4 season, they had The Genius of Photography by Jerry Badger. Very quickly learned that street photography probably wasn't going to be my thing, because it's kind of great if you're in New York. It's not so great if you live in a town that you can throw a tennis ball from one end to the other. I tried, but we'll get to that in a minute, because it did play quite a big part in how I ended up in people's homes. I had Stephen Polyakov's Shooting the Past, which I think a lot of people, when they talk about what inspires them, or documentaries about photography, they sometimes overlook things like Polyakov's Shooting the Past. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a wonderful 3-part series. Timothy Spall is in it, about a photo library that is going to get destroyed because the building has been taken over by a property development.
I haven't seen it. What's it called? What did you say it was?
It's called Shooting the Past.
Shooting
the Past. And essentially, on one level, it's about how can these people these misfits that work in this archive save it, but it's also about the power and longevity and the importance and the ripple effect of photographs. So they've got an archive. I won't spoil it for you because honestly, watching this, I mean, I watched The Genius of Photography at the same time. I've never seen anything that's had as powerful an impact upon me about photography as this mini series. It's impossibly good. It's a wonderful story, but that was giving me this information, and part of the information of the story is just how important photographs are and stories they contain, and how they can not only affect within the moment that they're made, but they can affect the much later or the future, I guess. If you make a photograph now, you're thinking, well, what will that do down the line? So we've got Tory austerity, which was very brutal in the Tories' first year. We were having a lot of news reports talking about carers, people that were being cared for, drains on the system. We were certainly seeing the advent, I would say, of a new type of programming that was very much demonizing anybody on benefits, much like programs like Benefit Street. And I realized that we were kind of entering this, do you know what? I'm not even going to be polite about it. I thought this was so fucking crazy. It was crazy. There's me, a carer, looking after someone whose life is hell. And on the news I'm watching about, it was like a Victorian freak show. There was so much hate beginning. The seeds of what we would come to see just pre-Brexit and vote for that. The first enemy of the 2000s was, in my mind, the disabled or the unemployed or the poor. They were the people that really had a kick in. So you put all of these things together, that gave me the blueprint for Small Town Inertia. All of those little elements combined, they build what I envisaged Small Town Inertia would be. I wanted to go out into my community, and I would only encounter people naturally and organically. So if I got chatting to someone in the shopping queue, okay, I've met someone. If I meet someone at the dispensary, that was me meeting someone. I met a couple of people through doing street portraits, but that was maybe only one that I did that with. I didn't set out to meet people as a photographer. I was meeting people really as myself for the first time in a long time. So I was meeting them in a very real sense, and I was building my own kind of like ethical blueprint based on something really simple, which is just you treat people as you want to be treated. So the relationships, they weren't formed from the hunger of a photographer looking for subjects. It was more a guy looking for a community.
I am so thrilled that you kindly agreed to come and speak on the show, because this right here, hearing you talk about your journey into photography, is exactly why I wanted to start the podcast, because everyone's journey is so incredibly unique. I think this is one of those episodes that it just transcends far beyond photography. There's so many people that will be able to relate to your situation, and just hearing you talk about looking after and being a full-time carer for 10 years and the pressure cooker that built for you and your life. I mean, I looked after my dad for 5-6 months before he passed away, pretty much full-time, and it was, I can't imagine doing it for 10 years, and I can't even begin to think what it would do for you. And just when you said about you lost sight of your dream, and it really is the ultimate sacrifice that you've given to be a carer.
You feel so selfish though, thinking that.
I
felt so selfish in the moment. It's so difficult. For the longest time, I didn't think about it. Time changes when you do this full time. It's something that the whole country is now having to deal with. Being in isolation, being in lockdown, time, it was really weird that, I was watching Twitter and people were saying, well, what day is it? I thought, my God, I felt like that for like 20 years because it was like a blink, and because every day's the same. Every day's like the world's worst version of Groundhog Day. And you blink and it's, where the fuck did those 10 years go? What? And it wasn't something that I was thinking all the time. It was really like a very powerful moment where I realized, wow, that's gone. That time's gone. Yeah. And that's difficult to deal with because you do feel really guilty. I mean, of course, you shouldn't. It's only natural to have those thoughts at some point. Any carer will tell you. I think even parents would tell you. It's an impossibly hard role to fulfill in life, I think. And time goes really quickly. It goes really quickly. I mean, I'm not a parent. I don't have kids, but I did just lose my dog. And I was like, Christ, 14 years has just gone woof. So, and being a carer, it goes even quicker and more surreally. And one thing for sure that I didn't notice was the kind of water torture effect of how it was, the eroding effect it was having on me, which I fully paid the price for about 6 years into working on Small Town Inertia, because I can distinctly remember doing my first ever talk was with MiniClick in Brighton, and it was really great. I did vividly remember somebody in the audience saying, "Well, what do you do for you? How are you caring for yourself? How do you work on these stories and decompress? And will you stop?" And again, like the arrogance of me at 20 something going, I'll go home and fix this. This is fine. I kind of flippantly remember saying, no, it's fine. I love doing this. So I'll be great. You fast forward 10 years and I'm having, the onset of PTSD and, an 18-month prolonged panic attack and anxiety as a result of not knowing. There's no, if you're, how do I put this? I'm self-taught. I didn't go to a college. I've had amazing mentors and friends online that have been utterly life-changing, that I consider I consider everybody as part of my family. I really do. But I didn't have anybody sit me down and say, look, you need to have an on and an off. You can't be on all the time. And I was on for 10 straight years working on Small Town Inertia and being a carer at the same time. So my routine would more often than not be, seeing mum having a really difficult situation, maybe a seizure. She wakes up from cyclic dreams of her rape. Every morning. Every morning's the same. And then I'd go out and I would say, photograph and interview. And more importantly than both of those things, I'd be absolutely 100% present as myself, as a human being. And then I'd come home, I'd work on the pictures, I'd share them. And then I'd go to bed for 10 years. And you can only fit a pint of stress in a pint pot. You can't fit 20 pints. So then that's some a doctor said anyway, that was a learning curve. But in a really weird way, it kind of it feeds back into the stories. When we were speaking before we went live, talking about things that we share in common, or I share in common with the stories. One of the longest stories I've worked on is with Tilney One, who's suffers greatly from anxiety and schizophrenia. I never thought I'd have anything in common with him, let alone mental health issues. And it was kind of incredible to have that. Almost in a kind of, it sounds perverse to say that going through that experience benefited me. But did it, because it's a very different thing. How do I say? I just felt very enlightened by it. It's not something that I'm down about. It's certainly not something that I'm reserved about speaking. There's no stigma in it. We've all had colds. We've all stubbed our toes. We all have periods of time that, you know, our heart gets broken, or we just get mentally exhausted. So in a funny kind of a way, I'd kind of got back on track just before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hits when I'm about to finish off book 2, and I'm like, oh, okay. So but the extra time kind of getting strong again has been really good for me. Yeah.
You mentioned then that
yes,
it helped you having those conversations. Do you think you'd have found that form of therapy almost for yourself, talking to people and opening up, had you not found photography?
No, I'd be dead. There's no question about that in my mind. Yeah, no, I was self-medicating. I was drinking really fucking heavily before I had the camera. In fact, having the camera and getting my old dog as a puppy are the two things that stopped me doing that. I was a high-functioning alcoholic without any question of a doubt. I could be as drunk as anything and still do everything that I had to do. No one would ever know, and I'd always do it in my off time. But I haven't had a drink in, I don't know, 15 years. And it's funny, you know, time gives you great perspective. You know, I can see how, you know, most people that have an addiction, they're trying to heal something. You know, it starts off as I'm the life and soul of the party, but there's always something a little bit deeper, I think. If you get to a stage where you become reliant on something, or that's the thing that you turn to, more often than not, you're missing something. And I know what I was missing. I was missing anyone to really talk to. It was, and, you know, we're talking about very early 2000s here. No, even before that, 1990, what was it? Where are we? No, when would it be? 2006. Yeah. Even then, it was very difficult to talk about, you know, men's health issues, mental health issues. You couple with that just how isolated I am here, socially and kind of geographically. Yeah. If it hadn't been photography, because one of the reasons that I made the decision to stop drinking really quickly after getting the camera, it's probably within those first 2 weeks, was I wanted to be 100% focused on this.
I was going to say, is that because you think you found a focus and something to channel your energy?
I didn't want to wake up with a hangover. I didn't want to be, I mean, I'd also had enough of kind of beating myself up, really. I mean, it's the stupidest thing in the world, isn't it? That you feel in pain, so you inflict more pain upon yourself. But that was something that I did a lot.
But do you think it's because you found something for yourself in photography?
No, I found, I suppose I found something for myself, but more importantly, I found myself through photography. What it did was it woke me up out of a vicious circle. And the thing that I liked about photography, I suppose, on a very personal level was I felt like I'd spent too much time looking inwards. You know, that's something that you tend to do when you're very isolated and you've got a very, or even non-existent social life. You're not talking backwards and forwards. You're not listening to other people's problems, and they're not listening to yours because you don't have anyone. So the thing I liked about the camera was I was just looking out. I was looking at other people, and people were kind of coming in through the lens. But it's more than that. It helped me communicate again. And I found that what I really wanted to do, after feeling like for such a long time I'd just been in my own head listening to my own problems and the things that I was having to deal with here, that I wanted to just fill myself with other people. And I was really attentive. And to this day, I'm so passionate about that. You know, just listen, like a fundamental part of my photography is listening. And it's important to note that for me, within whatever Small Town Inertia is, the photographs are very much a tool. I'm hyper aware of this. And if anything, the certainly within the, you know, behind Oz's curtain, that the photographs are second or third priority. Obviously, with the other side of the curtain is the photographs are an integral part of it, but the integral part of it that they are within the mechanics of what Small Inertia is they're a hook. I say this a lot. When we live in a mixed blessing moment. We have the ability to share globally. You know, I can sit here and I can put a picture out, and anyone on the planet might come across it. But they do it at such a speed that you have to make a really good photograph to stop someone in their tracks, just long enough that they might read for me, the really important part, which is the testimony. So for me, photographs are as much a tool as a camera. They're a visual device that hooks someone hard enough and strong enough that they stop this constant flick, 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 flick river, this tsunami of what I had for my tea. These are my fucking trainers. Grab them long enough that they read that testimony, and if they do that, maybe you've got a chance of doing, which is at the core of all of this, which is amplifying a voice that already exists. I get very annoyed when people, you know, the whole giving people a voice. You don't give anyone a voice. It's nonsense. Everybody has a voice. It's just whether or not they're in a position for it to actually be borne witness to. And a lot of people find their voice in their flat, screaming at the roof, in moments of complete aloneness, thinking, I've got all of this stuff inside me, but there's no one to talk to. There's no one listening. I turn the TV on. They're not talking about it. So, yeah, for me, it's all about amplifying voices that already exist, issues that already exist. Yeah.
You mentioned the importance of the testimony that accompany your images, and I completely agree with you. That is fundamental to your work and telling these stories. In the early stages, you mentioned earlier with WH, it was whilst you wrote the testimony, you hadn't documented it as such. It was your memory of WH. With your subjects now, how do you go about documenting their story? And I mean, actually, when you're spending time with them, do you record audio? Do you film? Do you write stuff down? How does it work?
All of the above, yeah. Well, for one, I realized really quickly that you have to have the means to record an interview. I mean, a lot of things happen at once. I mean, I was very turned on by, where do we go? We'll go right back to the beginning again. So I'm putting images on Flickr. I discover what a blog is. I think, okay, I'll do one of those. Didn't know what the hell it was, but it seems to start to become in fashion. And I had this, I'm learning all the time. Okay, so I've learned how to do what I'm doing now while I was doing it. So when the blog started, I was still finding out about the history of photography, the technical aspect of photography, how to use things like computers, how to use things like Photoshop. It's all been learn as you go, right in at the deep end. And from day one, I've had to learn as I go, which is beautiful, I think, because it is the journey. There is no destination. It's all learning forever. And you can't be hard on how bad you think you were at the start. You're only as good as your last picture, so it's always moving forwards and always moving forwards. So I remember I bought a old Marantz tape cassette, field recorder from a charity shop. And that's what I used for the first, I think, year. One of the most amazing things that happens and still happens is I've come into contact with so many either professional photojournalists, ex-professional journalists, photographers, who will go into their drawer of stuff and say, look, I've got a recorder, here you go, use this. That happens. I was featured, the very first couple of features I had were with Hungry Eye magazine, Grant Scott, you'll know as United Nations Photography, and Duck Rabbit. And when Dark Rabbit featured me, I think the tagline was something like, why Small Town Inertia is the most important British photo documentary right now. Now, I was 6 months in when that was said, and it opened up the photographic community to me in a way that utterly changed my life, because I can't afford to do any of this stuff. It's crazy. I live on a carer's allowance. That's it. Without wanting to sound too, bogged down by classism, people like me aren't supposed to do shit like this. There's not the opportunity. Most other people like me are more concerned about where the fuck am I going to pay the rent from this week? How am I going to eat this week? They're not given the opportunity. There's no opportunity to kind of indulge yourself in a dream. I'm just a really tenacious motherfucker, and I really need to do this. But I'm a very small component of this. The most important people are the people within the stories and also the audience, because without the audience, I couldn't do it, because they've helped me so much. And without the people within the stories, I couldn't do it, because I'd just be making pictures of empty rooms. This comes back again to like this sense of duty. I find it really difficult to take compliments about my photographs for a really simple reason. They should be good. If I was making bad pictures, and you kind of always feel like you are anyway, time to time someone will say, this is great. And I suppose my overriding impulse is, well, they should be good. Because if they're not good, I've really let this person down. The only thing that I'm here to do is do the best job I can. And I don't see any plumbers, giving each other pats on the back for fitting a good sink, for, that shower you put in, you've done a really good job. That's brilliant. You're an artist for doing that. It's funny. It's weird. It's weird. When you're I suppose it's because I have a presence online. I have a presence within a element of the photographic community, and people want to say to you, that's a great picture, but it's always sat really uncomfortably with me. I try, within the stories themselves, there's kind of like maybe a contemporary trend where a lot of documentary work is like post-truth and post-real, and a lot of documentary work is self-documentary work. It's not about other people. It's about the self. I wanted to keep myself all the way the fuck out of these stories. So you don't really see my presence in the narrative. Certainly if you go to the Small Town Inertia website, there'll be a little brief introduction, but then it's straight into quotes. Most of the stories are comprised of testimony, because it's not my story. The story is the person within the story. I'm just the guy, the other side. I've got to stay out of it. Obviously, when we do things like this, I have to involve myself, because I'm the representative. I'm the advocate, the custodian, really, of all of this testimony that's been shared. So again, that's a part of the duty, a duty of responsibility. If you've been given this incredible, it's a fucking vast amount of trust to give someone that you don't know. Everybody that is within these stories I've met as a complete stranger, and we've formed the best relationships of my life, without any doubt. I love everybody that I photograph unreservedly. I speak to everyone all the time. They've all changed my life profoundly. The responsibility for a picture doesn't end when you press the shutter. Certainly not with work like this. Obviously I'm not talking about, fine art or other genres of photography, but when you're making work within your own community, you're making work with other human beings, and it's maybe part of a documentary tradition or a humanist tradition. You can't just cast off the images and the stories into the ether and keep your fingers crossed. It's a continual relationship, which is only ever heightened by working long form. because it's not a 15-minute. It's not speed dating. What I do, and I'm not alone in this. There's a long tradition that I think kind of stagnated in the early 90s. If you look at the tradition of long form or certainly community-based documentary work, it was so strong in England, in Britain, so strong. You look at the work from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It's fucking amazing in the 80s. Try and find some from the 90s. Yeah,
I completely agree. And it's slowly, I think, with things like podcasts, I think it is, and your work, it is the long form interview and the long form story is definitely having a resurgence. You mentioned
100%. Man, I've noticed it from when I've started, and with photography as well. But in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, yeah, of course, there's always someone out there doing it, but it wasn't a done thing. I mean,
no,
the whole photographic world has changed so much anyway, hasn't it? I mean, where do you get published? Who commissions you? Who's commissioning long form stories about austerity? It doesn't happen. You know, it's not happening. They're commissioning Benefit Street, or, you know what I mean? It's like, I mean, even with COVID, there's been some interesting work. Imagine if COVID had happened in the 1950s and picture post was still available. The amount of photography, and this is the vital thing for me. I don't think photography's power has diminished from the day it was invented. I still think it's the most vital, impactful, important medium for sharing our shared experience with each other. You know, for amplifying and taking a story from like I said to you at the beginning of this. You know, I can be in a house on one side of the street with desperate poverty, and the other side of the street, he's got a vintage Porsche, and they don't know each other exist. They don't know, and photography is so important, not just because of things like Instagram and Facebook and all the social media, because it still has that power that it's always had. It can drop you to tears in a heartbeat. You know, I was looking just this week at the photographs of that poor refugee boy that drowned. That picture makes me cry every time I see it. I don't know how you can look at that and not have it affect you in a way that the written word would struggle to do. You know, in a way that the written word would struggle. You could describe it. It would be very different than experiencing even film footage. There's something about a photograph that has a direct impact within the very core of us. Saying that, I do find it very important to couple images with words. That's a safeguard against people's prejudice.
Well, that's what I was going to say, actually, which is what is so, I think, engaging about your work, is that there are those images of the people we see, but they're also coupled with a real, truthful story. How long will you, and you mentioned earlier when you began and you didn't necessarily start out to photograph people, it was more about finding a community and finding your place within the community. How long, and I know it will vary completely depending on who you're photographing, but how long will you typically spend with someone and getting to know them and their lives before you start photographing them?
Yeah, it does vary. From one end of the spectrum, it's been 30 seconds. On the other end, it's been 7 years. It all depends on the individual.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 7 years from first speaking with them to photographing them. Wow.
Yeah. I'll just clarify one thing. Yes, it was about finding my community again, but there was already the seed of, okay, I think I can do this. I think I have a way of resisting what I see as a really powerful injustice. And the injustice I saw was, why is there no fucking report of how hard austerity is on people? Because if this is happening in my town, it's happening in your town or the next town across, or this is happening all over the country. And that angered me. Still does, because austerity hasn't finished. In the meantime, we've had Brexit and now we've got a pandemic. And if people think austerity was bad, strap in, because we are going to be fucked after this COVID thing. And the levels of poverty and stress and pain that I saw the most vulnerable bear the brunt of for a decade, that's not going to be everyone. And I don't want to be on a downer, but that's you got to be a realist about this. And the one thing that so there's the spice, here's the sugar. The sugar is, if we don't very quickly learn how to get back to a sense of community, individually we're fucked. It's gonna have to take people coming together to sort this out, because it's not going to come from the top down. There's not going to be an easy fix. This is going to be something that's, again, it's going to be the ripple effect. That we've had a very large pebble thrown into the water this time, one that's going to affect everybody. And I think that there's two ways forwards. We can be, we can carry on the wonderful thing that Thatcher started, which is every man for himself, and tread on who you can to get to the top. That ain't going to work. No, that's not going to work. We have to come together. We have to rely on each other, and we have to be there for each other. The problem is, I suppose, that everybody that's already endured 10 years of austerity are now probably going to endure another 20 of even more dire straits. So again, I just hope that people stop punching down and really start helping. You know, not just themselves, not just their neighbor, but you got to start looking out for the people that are vulnerable and are overlooked, because they're so easy to walk over. They're so easy to tread on. They're so easy to ignore. And that's got to change. If we want to call ourselves Great Britain, we have to be great, because I don't think we've been that for a long time.
You mentioned about building relationships and caring for one another and being there for one another. The people you photograph, I was looking at your work, and there's nothing is staged. It's honest, it's truthful, and looking at the images, you can tell that in some of them it is just you and the person you're photographing.
Almost always, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I mean, apart from where there's a couple, for example.
Yeah.
How will you go about practically capturing that truthfulness? For example, if you're spending time with someone, will you step back and observe them in their environment, going about their day-to-day life, and photograph almost as if you're not there? Or will you perhaps, if you've seen something that will tell the story that they've told you through an image, will you perhaps direct them to capture an image that will tell their truth? Does that make sense?
I think I know what you mean. And the answer is really simple. How do you get intimacy with a lover? It's time and trust and understanding each other and communicating. So the way that I've always worked is there always has to be consent, and there always has to be a plan. So let's say I turn up at Tilney one's house. The first thing I'll say is, "How you doing?" We would have talked about this on the telephone or Facebook or something beforehand. But immediately upon arriving, it will be a hug. How you doing? And then obviously I'll say, "Look, what do you want to do today? Do you feel like doing any pictures? Do you just want to chat? Do you want to do an interview? Do you want to do a portrait? Do you want to pretend like I'm not here, and then I'm not here, but I'm making photographs?" So I play it very much by ear, but it's weird because sometimes I say that it takes a long time to get to that place. But I made one of the most intimate pictures I've ever made within 30 seconds of being in someone's flat. So I think what it is it's I mean, you have to be really honest with the person that you're working with, and you are working with them. You're not there outside of them on a human level, on a really human level. So, for example, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's the picture. It's a very close, tight portrait, probably the only portrait I've ever shot on a 50mm. It's not a portrait, it's a documentary photograph, but it looks like a portrait of Shawnee crying. It's in the book.
I do know the one. One.
I'd met him briefly outside a pub where I'd taken another photograph of him where he's lifting his shirt up, showing some tattoos on his back. And I was really enamored with this guy. I wanted to find out, A, if I could get a print to him, and B, I wanted to find out if he was okay, because he was pretty fucked up when I saw him outside the pub. I found out who he was, where he lived, went to visit him. And again, it was like it's a repeating pattern that I find, that maybe people don't go and see their priest. Maybe people don't go to the bar so much and talk to the barman. That's kind of a role that I was fulfilling. And I quickly understood that it's quite easy to talk to someone that you don't know if they're willing to listen to you and not judge you. And that's how all of these relationships have started. I suppose that moment is quite intoxicating. If you go to someone that hasn't got anyone to talk to, or maybe they've got a lot of people that they can talk to, but they can't talk to about how they really feel. You know, they somehow feel that that's, you know, maybe they're going to feel embarrassed about doing it. Maybe they feel like that person might then go and lie about it and talk shit about them. And it's, you know, it's a small town. So, but I found that it was really easy for me to talk with them, and it was very easy for them to talk with me and offload a lot of weight and trouble and pain. Yeah, so I was in Shawnee's flat for 30 seconds, and bang, he was straight into the things that were really bothering him, and he started to cry. My initial reaction was like, I'll stop. You know, this is because 50mm, you'll know this. I'm that far away, an arm's length. And he was like, don't you fucking dare. You know, this is the most me I've been. And if anyone that knows me sees this, they'll see a side of me that I've hidden for most of my adult life. That I do have feelings, that I do have a tender side, that I do have emotions, that I do care about the things I've done wrong, and I'm scared. So that can happen in 30 seconds. But then with Carl, again from the book, he was very scared of having his photograph made for maybe 6-7 years. So I wouldn't ask him about it. I'd talk to him about him and his life. And then slowly and surely over the 6 years, we became really good friends. I mean, it's like every guy in the book's my brother, every girl in the book, every woman in the book's my sister. And this is, I'm an only child, but they're all my family. And it always starts with meeting a stranger, and with everyone. The only way that I kind of stop working with someone is if they pass away or move away. And that's proved to be the case. And then with Carl, just one day he said to me, I'm ready to do it. And I kind of couldn't stop him. We made a short film together. Instantly we did, and he'll message me every other day. When are you coming round? When are you coming round? It's a beautiful thing. It's almost impossible to convey how honored I feel to have been given, you know, to be given so much trust and love and friendship by all the people that we make this work together. It's kind of like the life I always wanted, and so much more. If I'd ended up being a painter, I'd have probably turned into a right narcissistic prick. Painting's quite a lot about ego. For me, photography isn't. You know, it's a shield, not a sword. You know, I'm not attacking. I'm trying to defend. But it's also a way of helping my community. And this was completely unexpected, of helping my family, my friends. This is what these people become. And it's mutual as well, you know. And I didn't expect that. I wasn't even looking for that. But I've got it, and it's the most amazing thing in the world.
We've mentioned the book on numerous occasions here, and I think we should look at it because, so this is volume 1, and you've mentioned that volume 2 is that ready to go out, did you say?
No, it's about halfway complete.
Right, okay.
About halfway, and then the pandemic hit. So yeah, book 2 is coming.
So with volume 1, was it, obviously, you mentioned at the beginning it was about finding community, so the book, I'm guessing, wasn't necessarily on your radar. How did you, or do you remember the point where you suddenly thought this could be a book? And how did you go about getting volume 1 published and put together?
It's funny because I'm laughing to myself because I know the story. I had no inclination whatsoever to do a book because I was too completely involved in learning how to make these blog entries, and I was getting more and more deeply involved in long form. Long form for me at the start was 2 weeks. Then it became 2 months, and then it became a year or 2 because I was learning what a story arc was. And the original idea was that Small Town Inertia was episodic, almost like a soap opera. It was a very naive thought in that, how do you get people to care about people? Well, people seem to give a real massive fuck about soap operas. Why is that? Well, they tune in and they see it every week. They get to know them over a long period of time. I'm not a fan, so I don't watch TV. I was also informed by things that I really love, Life magazine and the Picture Post. And this idea that I could do something with regular updates, kind of like dispatches, I suppose. Oh, God, I've had a brain fade right in the middle of what I was saying. I knew it would happen at some point. You ever get that? Just midway.
Oh,
God,
what
was the question? What was the question again? It was... I
was saying, how did you, or how did the idea of creating a book form?
So I'm going on, and suddenly I'm hitting my stride. I feel I've got kind of really into how I wanted to work. I got a little bit more confident with actually making photographs, and things were going well. Out of the blue, 100% out of the blue, there's a comment left on my blog, which is still there. Anyone can go and read it, from Colin Wilkinson at the Blue Coat Press, saying, "This is great. Do you want to do a book?" Now, my first thought is, this is a wind-up. Then I start talking with Colin, and I find out very quickly this is not a wind-up. He's 100% serious about this. And then my reaction is, oh, God, no, I'm not ready. I've not done enough work. These stories, it's not a long enough story arc. I'm thinking now in the terms of it's got to be a decade. It's got to be, longer even. And he says something that, Colin's like my dad. He truly is. He's like my second dad in so many ways. He gave me one of the greatest pieces of advice on what we do here. When I say we, it's not like the royal we. Very far from it. I always say we because it's me and the people within the stories, because it's a collaboration.
Yes. Yeah.
He said, you don't want to put this book out after the fact. You don't want to put this book out when the architects of the very thing that you're documenting, or one of the things, because it's 2 things. One is the effects of austerity, and 2, it's the heroic endurance of people enduring it. He said, look, you want to get it out now when these people are still in office. You want it to be of the moment, not retrospective. You want it to be a talking point and an informative piece, so people can write to their MP and say, what the fuck are you doing? You're killing people. This is crazy. You don't want to do it when they're all sat in the House of Lords, which invariably they will be. And instantly I was like, yeah, right, yes, do it. Straight away. I edited the book in 30 minutes because I'd lived it for coming on for 10 years then. So I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to make a book that spans 10 years, but it could be 24 hours. There's a really important reason for that. Austerity and poverty and being on benefits. Again, it comes back to this. It's kind of like the worst Groundhog Day effect. Every day is kind of like the same. There is no, it's very rare to have evolution out of it. you're stuck in this catch-22 trap, often, almost always, through reasons not of your control. It could be you're at the behest of your illness, of your mental health, your physical health, because the system isn't helping. The system is punishing. The system is chains. The system is counterproductive to any alleviation from the pain that you're in from your condition, your social situation. It's as though the state is waterboarding vulnerable people. So that was the idea that I had. That's the idea that I stuck with. The book was sequenced and edited in probably half an hour. But, I've been so used to sequencing images for stories. I learned how to do that through the blog. So I knew what. It's funny. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a camera tech the other day, and we were talking about making prints and stuff. And he says, "You're fucked if you don't know what you want, but you know how to do it. And it's great if you know what you want, but you don't know how to do it. Because you can always learn how to do something. But if you've got no idea, you've got no passion, you've got no reason for doing it, that's a proper problem. And that's a common problem, I think. It's a common problem for people. What can my project be? Well, I don't think of Small Town Inertia as a project. It's my life, and it's the people around. It's my community's life. It's not something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It is me, and it is the people in the stories.
You mentioned then as well that you edited the book in 30 minutes, which is incredible. But you also said that you'd kind of been training for that edit anyway by doing the blogs. But how did you settle on the image for the front cover?
So much of what I do is instinct, and I often ask myself, well, what is instinct? Is instinct luck? Is it chance? Or is it a culmination of your whole life? And I was lucky in that I had a life pre-photography, in that I'd been to art school, I'd studied the history of painting, I'd studied painters, I had a long time to watch a lot of cinema, which is a huge passion of mine. I'd had a long time to read a lot of books, listen to a lot of music, and, I've always been in love with a lot of different media, a lot of different arts. Now, if that all combined over the course of, 30 years doesn't prepare you for, maybe that's what informs my photographic instinct, because so much of it, I find myself, there's a great amount that photographers can learn from painting, composition, lighting, interacting with the people that they're working with, for sure, if you're a portrait painter, for example. So all my aesthetics come from painting and cinema. They don't come from photography. I very vividly remember saying to myself, I'm never going to look at a photography book for visual or aesthetic inspiration, ever. That's such a slippery slope. But more importantly than that, I never wanted to pay that little respect to the people within those photographers' work. When you look at a book by Don McCullen or Donna Ferrato or any photographer you care to choose, if they work with people, they don't want you looking at those pictures going, I wonder what f-stop that was. Or, that's a really good piece of art. That's a really good photograph. They only want you to pay attention to what's actually happening in that photograph, those people, that moment. So I don't look at photography books for aesthetic inspiration. I always look at a photography book as a human being, unadulterated by this photographic element that I have to me. I think that's really important that other photographers do that, because it's a bit like I used to be in bands, and it's really easy to listen to a really great Bob Dylan song, go into a rehearsal room, and fuck me if you haven't just written Subterranean Homesick Blues and you're rewriting a song because you love it. And I love that a lot of people love photography, but it can't be your only source of inspiration. It can't be. And I think that as with most things that you love, you kind of get mildly obsessed by it, and you have to be, and you get really intoxicated by it, and you can sometimes veer into this area where you're choosing to be influenced, and it can be kind of dangerous to just limit yourself to one inspiration. So yeah, for me, I've stuck true to my word there. I don't look at other photographers for photographic inspiration. What I do look at them for is lessons in morality. What are they like with the people that they photograph? How do they conduct themselves? These are things that I think are really good to take from peers. Yeah, so all of that boiled down. Yeah, I was just very instinctive about everything. There was no real kind of, I don't remember like struggling to pick a cover picture. It was just the obvious choice. It was instinct that told me that it should be that.
It's a stunning image. I'm looking at it as we speak, and there's so many elements within it. You've got one gentleman on the television, and the young lady is watching the TV. Her partner is playing with the dog, and the expression on the dog's face, it's almost like he's looking at you. There's a bag of sugar next to the television. There's so many elements within it that tell a very clear and engaging story that makes you want to find out more about the couple that are featured in it. I just wondered,
do you know what the TV program is?
My guess.
You probably can't from that, but it's Jeremy Kyle. There's another shot from that sequence with Jeremy Kyle. I can't even remember if it's in the book. It might be pointing, and he's pointing at Si in that photograph from that photograph. Because I forgot to mention Jeremy Kyle. How could I? Now it's thankfully gone from our airwaves, but the irony, that show was, it's very difficult for me to watch that show when it was on. It was a poison, I think. It's a crazy situation when you get people with nothing blaming other people with nothing for their problems. It's my neighbour's problem. They're the reason my life's fucking terrible. They're not, and it's a very subtle kind of, not mind control, but it's a very subtle way of engineering a social strata. Because when they're blaming each other, they're not saying, actually, pointing up, it's you. Because you're the one with the power, the money, the control, the ability, the opportunity to actually fulfill your function, your chosen function, which is to take care of the people that need help. So that show, detest it. That might have had something to do with it being on the cover, because TV was really, one of the things that I really reacted against was TV. I think that's responsible for a lot of the problems we find ourselves in. You know, I'm used to the people around me getting all of their information from single point media at the beginning. You know, they'd get it from the Daily Mail. They'd get it from BBC One or Sky News. Now, of course, people are getting it from the internet as well. I'm with John Lennon on this. Just give me the truth. If I want the news, just give me the facts. Fuck your editorial. I just want to know what happened, and then I'll make my own mind up about how I should feel about it. That's not the news very often now. The news is, you know, there's so much editorial to it. It's even worse in America. And look what we've ended up with. Look at what's happening. It's crazy.
Well, I think the news is, I heard it put beautifully the other day by someone who said the worst way to consume news is to turn on a fire hydrant. And it's so true, because there are so many options to consume news nowadays that I think for your own sanity, you have to be very specific about what you do choose. Speaking 100%. Of choosing images, well, we're talking about choosing news, obviously, but in terms of choosing images, as a photographer, will you ever, if you've taken a brilliant shot as a photographer, but it doesn't necessarily tell the truth of the person's story you're photographing, will you use that image, or will that end up on the edit floor?
Almost all the work that I make is chronological. So when I'm building a story, you'll see them sequentially. So in terms of, when the events happened, how the story, the journey from A to B. So all the work's made chronologically. I won't begin with an image taken 6 months after the first image, that sort of thing. But I know exactly what you're talking about. If I'll answer it, but I'll also add this. I've been superseded as editor many times by the people in the stories where, I've made some pictures that I felt were too extreme. And I've showed them and they've said, why would you leave that one out? That's it. That's it. I'll give you an example. It was with Simon in the Living with Epilepsy series. And we'd often talked about what would happen in the event of him having a seizure. And he said, well, you take a picture. You're making a story about epilepsy. It doesn't seem sensible to not show the one thing that the story is about, which is the one thing that people often get wrong. Anyway, long story short, it comes to a moment where he has a seizure in front of me, and I'll admit, given the fact that I'm a carer that's probably seen over 100,000 seizures in his life, the first thing I did was put him into recovery. Then I picked the camera up and I made some photographs. And the first thing he said to me when he came round was, "Did you get that?" And he was like hungry. I was like, it always leaves you in a state of shock. You can acclimatize yourself to these things, but seizures are really violent. And there's many, many different types of epileptic seizure. And Simon's seizure, atonic seizures, he drops with no warning, as though just like he's been shot in the head. There's no warning. It's just bang. He falls dead weight to the ground. And he'd smashed his head quite bad, and there was a lot of blood. So I was like reeling from this whilst dealing with it, which is what I suppose life trains you to do if you have to deal with these things. But his first thought was, did he get it? Did he get it? And I was like, should I really show that picture? And he was so insistent. He was so insistent. So insistent in a way that it kind of gave me confidence to rely on not the wishes, but okay, so sometimes you feel like maybe somebody would say something to please you. And I was always very wary of that. And I didn't want, you're very aware of people blowing smoke. And maybe sometimes somebody says that's fine when really it's not. What it did was I always have like checks that I have, so I'll sit on images for quite a long time before sharing them. And I'll go back and I'll say, are you sure? It's like the one with Shawnee. I waited quite a long time before I shared that one, because I wanted to ask him again and again and again if he was okay with it, because, I'm very explicit with the way that I do things with photographs and photo stories. And it's really simple and really straightforward. I work with everyone on trust. I don't use model releases, because I think if you introduce a contract, it already places like a power play between me and the person that I'm working with. I'm already saying, well, look, I'm different to you, so you have to sign off all of this to me, and now you're aware of that. You're aware that I'm other than you. So and it's the way that I've always worked from the very start. I'm very open about what happens to the work. It's not going to end up on a chocolate box. It's not going to end up anywhere other than somewhere that will serve the function that in turn is the reason that you're doing this. The reason you're doing this is you want people to be aware of you and your story. So the work has always only gone to exhibitions, magazines that feature the story or the issue behind the stories, or online. It doesn't go to stock images. It doesn't get, someone can't use it for some out of context. They can't use it out of context. And it's always worked. And the response is so kind of overwhelming, because you realize that you're helping someone do the one thing that they haven't ever been able to do, which is have someone pay the fuck attention to what's happening to them. And what angers me and saddens me so much is these are all really important issues. I don't think any of these are trivial issues. It's not like I've worked on a story about somebody that, can't buy the pair of shoes they want, or I can't even think of an example. These are all really important. They're not only important because of the pain and the stress and the desperateness of the situation. They're all indicative. They're all representative of failings of the system. In a world that was run right, I don't think many of the situations within the stories would exist. Therefore, there'd be no reason to document them. And I think it's important to document them for two reasons. One, you got to say that it happened. This is the thing with history. It's most often written by the victorious, isn't it? How many, when you learn history at school, you don't have much testimony by the people that we're talking. It's like you become a statistic. You're a number. This and this happened to that and that. It's very impersonal. A bit like the news. It's very impersonal. And I think that what that does is it kind of brings us up to be quite callous and distant and becomes sensational, or it becomes almost as though it's happening to like another species. Because surely if you watch the news and it touched you as it should, things would make things fucking change. Would make things change. We couldn't live seeing if it was touching us in the way that these things should. I mean, have we become so desensitized as a people that you can watch it and it's just like, yeah, oh, whatever. And that's why I love photography. That's why I love working on these stories, because it does touch people, and that's what the people in the stories want. So that's a happy,
But the people in the stories want them, and his instinct to ask you, did you capture it, is testimony to you and the way you photograph the people you're with and the relationships that you have with them. Which, on that note, actually, if you could frame only one image from Small Town Inertia, which one would it be? And why, I guess?
Crikey. That's really difficult. That's a really
or maybe,
difficult question.
I'm not sure whether framing is the right word, or if you could...
if I could pick one to represent all of the work from book one?
Yeah, so if you had an image to display on a billboard in Times Square or Leicester Square to show what your work represents, what would it be?
I think it would probably be the photograph of David sat in his bedroom, looking, I say looking, but with his face turned towards a window with light.
David is blind, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, David's blind.
Yes, I know the story.
There's a level of such profound heartbreak to that image. And this is the thing. This is the thing I think that people often forget, that, I was in that fucking room. I know David really, I mean, I know everybody in the book really well, but I've known David amongst the longest of anyone. And I find it really painful to look at the photographs that I make. I had an exhibition a couple of years ago in Newcastle at the Side Gallery, great gallery, my favourite gallery in the world. I had a panic attack just walking in there, because for me, what I'm doing is I'm walking into a room full of huge prints of really painful moments. In some cases, the people have passed away. And again, I just go back to, I'm a human being and then I'm a photographer. My human being will always react to these things before the photographer. Yeah, you have to manage your emotions, but it's really, really hard. I find it very hard to edit pictures. Find it very hard to talk about them. It's because it's very the relationships are very real. And even if the relationships weren't as profoundly deep as they are, it would still affect me, because it should. It shouldn't just be, that was a great picture, and it's a great picture because the light's good, and fuck that. It hurts. It hurts me to look at that photograph. It hurts me because I know David's blind. It hurts me because I know he's alone in that picture. It hurts me because I know 3 months later he'd be utterly alone because his mum would die. It hurts me because he's blind when, if things had gone differently, he wouldn't be blind. It hurts me that he's looking towards a window that he will never again look out and see the light coming from, of the outside world. It hurts me because I know how lonely he's going to be. It hurts me because in that moment he's getting abuse on the street for being a drain on the system, because he's taking money, because he's blind, because he's disabled. It hurts me because we've got such a cold and callous society now that people can feel within themselves justified that if they hear Ian Duncan Smith, for example, say something about benefits cheats, everybody's a benefits cheat. So therefore it's okay to go up to David and push him around in the street. So that picture does a lot for me. I think, if anything, it represents isolation really well. But I also see in it that he's very stoic, and he's a tough son of a bitch, Dave. He's had probably more thrown at him than anyone else I know in my life. And he's still just a proper hardcore outlaw. He loves it. He's like a cowboy. He feels like an outlaw, and he's like my Johnny Cash. He's amazing because he won't let the situation or people get him down. And that's the one thing that I really take away from the book, and definitely do book 2, is that these are strong people. These are really strong people. A lot of people don't have, they have run-of-the-mill problems, Oh, the table at such and such wasn't there on time, or can I get that other car this year, or where am I going on holiday, or, oh, the pandemic's terrible, why can't I go to the pub? They're the problems. The problems that I see my peers going through are fucking terrifying. And they go on and on and on and on and on. It's not a once in a blue moon occasion. It's not once every 6 months. It's every day, all the time. And when David would talk to me about turning on the radio and hearing, how hate crime had risen amongst the disabled and spikes for the first time in decades as a result of the narrative that was coming out of Westminster and the justification for austerities. You've got to remember that one of the very first things that came in under austerity was the bedroom tax. And that really affected the disabled and carers really, really, really hardly, profoundly. And it was like if you kind of track back from the very first year of Conservative austerity, you can see a kind of like a really weird, slow disintegration of the moral fabric, because that kind of led to Brexit. It led to a lot of things, a lot of hate in this country, and I feel like it kind of all started with the disabled community. I find it horrific. That's a really long-winded answer to what picture would do it, but it would probably be that one of David. Just because of the isolation, because it's not just his physical isolation from other people. It's representative of the isolation of everybody that was touched by austerity, and how alone they've been and continue to be through this experience, how no one really has their back. Obviously, there's some amazing, charity workers, amazing carers out there. I'm talking about the public, in terms of the public. We're seeing it now. I would have thought there would have been riots in the street over what's happened in care homes. But it seems to me the most anger is, well, I want to go to the beach. I want to go on holiday this year. Where's the righteous anger about how our most vulnerable have been left to suffer and die, and no one gives a fuck? And I think this is the main thing I love about photography, and the main reason I do it. I want people to give a fuck. That's it.
I think that is the best way that we can conclude our conversation. Jim Mortram, thank you ever so much for joining me on the Standout Photography Show.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
That was my conversation with none other than Jim Mortram. A huge thank you to Jim for taking the time to come and speak with me on the show. And again, Jim and I spoke for nearly 2 hours. In fact, over 2 hours, because we spoke quite a lot before we hit record. And I still feel like we only scratched the surface of the wonderful work that he has done over the years. I do hope you enjoyed listening to Jim as much as I enjoyed speaking with him. If you did, and you are enjoying what you hear on the Standout Photography Show, please support the show with your words, not your wallets. This show is completely free, and that's how it will always remain. So your kind words really do make a huge difference in securing the very finest working photographers in the world with very busy schedules. And I must say a personal thank you this week to Sci_Eppey, that is SI_EPPEY, aka Simon, on Instagram, who has been a huge supporter of the show since day one. And this week he wrote 5 stars top photography podcast, a truly entertaining, interesting and balanced look into photographers and how they made their journeys into the top of their game, a peek into processes, gear and what makes them different from others, with a thoughtful presenter who gets the best out of the guests. A great insight into photography. Simon, thank you very much for your continued support. Also, if there is someone that you would like to hear on the Standout Photography Show, as always, I am at your service. Do feel free to let me know on the Twittergrams at Matthew D.A. Walker. For now, thank you very much, as always, for tuning in. It has been an absolute pleasure to spend a small portion of your day with you. Do look after yourselves, and I will see you next time. Until then, I have been Matthew Walker, he has been Jim Mortram, and you have been sensational. Until next time, take care.